Lev Vygotsky is a key figure in the history of early childhood education. He was born in November of 1896 in Orsha, a city in the Western Russian Empire. In 1917, he earned a law degree at Moscow State University, where he studied a range of topics, including sociology, linguistics, psychology, and philosophy. His formal work in psychology began in 1924 at Moscow's Institute of Psychology. He completed a dissertation in 1925 on the psychology of art, but was awarded his degree in absentia due to an acute tuberculosis relapse that had left him incapacitated for a year. Following his illness, Vygotsky began researching topics like language, attention, and memory with the help of his students. Among those were Alexei Leontiev, the developmental psychologist and philosopher who developed activity theory, and neuropsychologist Alexander Luria, who authored Higher Cortical Functions in Man. Vygotsky worked closely with a number of like-minded researchers, both his peers and students, and conducted joint experiments with them. The core of what some have called the Vygotskyan circle consisted of the big three: Vygotsky himself, Luria, and Leontiev. The three became more largely associated with an informal network of psychologists, educationalists, medical specialists, physiologists, and neuroscientists. All of them spent years working intensely with Vygotsky and were clearly influenced by his ideas. The cross-pollination of ideas sometimes gets omitted in viewing Vygotsky as an autonomous, independent thinker. Vygotsky's two most often cited works are Thought and Language and Mind and Society. The mind, Vygotsky argues, cannot be understood in isolation from the surrounding society. Man is the only animal who uses tools to alter his own inner world as well as the world around him. From the handkerchief knotted as a simple mnemonic device to the complexities of symbolic language, society provides the individual with technology that can be used to shape the private processes of the mind. Mind and Society is a compilation and juxtaposition of writings that are taken from different Vygotsky works, written during different periods of his scientific career. In this book, Vygotsky applies his theoretical framework to the development of perception, attention, memory, language, and play, and then he examines its implications for education. In much of Vygotsky's renowned book, Thought and Language, he devotes discussions to developmental psychology. He makes the case that thought and language are not independent, as had been once believed. Instead, he suggests that thought develops through speech, both internal, private speech, and external speech, and that children's thinking is shaped by the way they communicate and interact linguistically with those around them. For example, in Thought and Language, Vygotsky writes, "The relation of thought to word is not a thing, but a process, a continual movement back and forth from thought to word and from word to thought. In that process, the relation of thought to word undergoes changes that themselves may be regarded as development in the functional sense. Thought is not merely expressed in words. It comes into existence through them. Every thought tends to connect something with something else, to establish a relation between things. Every thought moves, grows, and develops, fulfills a function, solves a problem. This flow of thought occurs as an inner movement through a series of planes. An analysis of the interaction of thought and word must begin with an investigation of the different phases and planes a thought traverses before it is embodied in words." There are several key ideas that we find in Vygotsky's various works, including the application of dialectical materialism to his ideas about inner and outer speech, the zone of proximal development, his historical cultural theory of human development, and the importance of the social environment that is interwoven throughout his theories. Each play a key role in what is considered developmentally appropriate practice today. Much of Vygotsky's approach to thinking about human development stems from dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is concerned with the general laws of change in development in nature, society, and thought. Dialectical materialism sees things in relations, analyzes them, and then reintegrates them into total movement. Dialectical materialism suggests that we must consider phenomena in their natural relations and not as isolated cases. All portions of the universe are related to each other and exert influence on each other. The slightest motion, the slightest alteration in one place, simultaneously changes everything else, whether great or small. Dialectical materialism asserts that matter is a process of constant moving and changing, thought and consciousness, and demands that all phenomena be considered in their indissoluble relations and that they must be considered in motion. When applied to human history, this is called, as some of you may have heard this phrase before, historical materialism. So Vygotsky was interested in the process of becoming, but not in the object of being, and was concerned with the original sources of development. Vygotsky said that to study something historically means to study it in the process of change, the basic demand of this dialectical method. Vygotsky constantly saw things in relationship and showed greater interest in the essence of relations and their complex inner nature. In essence, he was criticizing the stimulus-response approach, or what we would call behaviorism. And he believed that this approach analyzed stable, fixed objects. He instead advocated that psychological analysis of objects should be contrasted with the analysis of processes, which requires a dynamic display of the main points making up the process history. He believed that any psychological process, whether the development of thought or voluntary behavior, is a process undergoing changes right before one's eyes. So we need to focus not on the product of development, but the process, which we can connect to constructivism. Vygotsky's dialectical materialism was used in his psychological analysis in finding the inner law that caused the changing and evolution of the interaction between the biological and natural and cultural functions. He focused on the historically shaped and culturally transmitted psychology on human beings. He believed that psychology should not be an end to a means, but a means to telescope changes. In Vygotsky's investigation of the transformation of lower functions into higher functions, he considered each from in its growth and in it a necessary disappearance in its relationship with the other. For example, in studying the relationship between egocentric speech and social speech, which had been seen as two separate stages of human psychological development, he showed that egocentric speech is the transition from social speech. Egocentric speech does not simply die out or is not simply replaced by social speech as Piaget assumed, but it is transformed or develops into inner speech. Piaget studied the elements in separation and focused on the products of development, while Vygotsky looked at them in relations and drew attention to the process of changing. What separates Vygotsky from other psychologists is his dialectical materialist view. So, Vygotsky considered the relationship then between thought and language to also be dialectical. In other words, he opposed the idea that thought and speech should be analyzed separately. As a historical materialist, he viewed thought and speech as united. A word without meaning is an empty sound. Meaning, therefore, is a criterion of a word. It is indispensable as a phenomenon of speech. Word meanings change as children develop, and they change with the various ways in which thoughts function. Vygotsky saw the relationship of thought and word not as a thing, but as a process. He says, thought is not merely expressed in words, it becomes or comes into existence through them. Dialectical historical materialism can be described as enabling us to logically and consistently express the real interconnectedness and motion of things. As a dialectical materialist, Vygotsky considered the interaction between human development and learning to be inseparable, and he accused Piaget, his contemporary at the time, of failing to see the interaction between these two things. For Piaget, development was always a prerequisite to learning, which learning forms for him a superstructure over development, leaving development unaltered. For Vygotsky, the process of development and learning were mutually dependent and interactive. Vygotsky believed that development and learning are interrelated from the child's very first day of life outside the womb. Perhaps one of the concepts Vygotsky is most known for is the zone of proximal development. And this is a key construct of his theory of learning and development. The zone of proximal development is defined as the space between what a learner can do without assistance and what a learner can do with adult guidance, or in collaboration with more capable peers. Vygotsky believed that when a student is in the zone of proximal development for a particular task, providing the appropriate assistance will give the student enough of a boost to achieve the task. To assist a person to move through the zone of proximal development, educators are encouraged to focus on some important components that aid the learning process. First is the presence of someone with knowledge and skills beyond that of the learner, or what we would call a more knowledgeable other. Another would be social interactions with a skillful tutor that allows the learner to observe and practice their skills. And then we have scaffolding or supportive activities provided by the educator or more competent peer to support the student as they are led through the zone of proximal development. The more knowledgeable other is somewhat self-explanatory. It refers to someone who has a better understanding or a higher ability level than the learner with respect to a particular task or process or concept. And although the implication is that the more knowledgeable other is a teacher or an older adult, this is not necessarily the case. Many times, a child's peers or an adult's children may be the individuals with more knowledge or experience. According to Vygotsky, much important learning by the child occurs through social interaction with a skillful tutor. The tutor may model behaviors or provide verbal instructions for the child. And Vygotsky referred to this as cooperative or collaborative dialogue. The child seeks to understand the actions or instructions provided by the tutor. This could be a parent or a teacher, and then internalizes the information and uses it to guide or regulate their own performance. His zone, or notion, I should say, of the zone of proximal development allows us to take into account not only the cycles and maturation processes that have already been completed, but also those processes already in a state of motion. In contrast with other theories in which learning lags behind the process of development, he assumed that learning aims for a new stage of the developmental process. He saw the relationship between development and learning to be complex and dynamic. They are not mutually exclusive, as suggested by Piaget. And again, it is his historical or dialectical materialist approach that distinguishes him from others. Vygotsky saw language as a fundamental tool that has a fundamental effect on human development. For Vygotsky, language is a psychological tool that connects humans with their external world and helps humans develop from a biological to a conscious level and master their own action. The use of language brings a revolutionary change to human development, a change with the relationship with others, a change in one's relationship to the self, and a change in one's way of thinking. Vygotsky is quoted as saying, "If one changes the tools of thinking available to a child, his or her mind will have a radically different structure." Vygotsky asserted that the use of language and school learning contribute to a revolutionary change in human development. He referred to psychological tools as instruments for the construction of higher processes, and he wrote, "In the instrumental act, humans master themselves from the outside through psychological tools." For Vygotsky, cultural influences are key in affecting child development. Vygotsky believed that cultural influences affect development twice. First between people at the interpsychological level, and then inside the child at the intrapsychological level. He's quoted as saying, "All of the building blocks of higher behavior seem absolutely materialistic, and lower mental functions are structured and organized according to specifically human social goals and means of contact." In psychology, social interaction is an external activity, which Vygotsky believed is not only conditionally connected with the external environment, but it also makes internal activity possible. They internalize and reconstruct external activity. It is the external factors that stimulate action, and the internal factors that reorganize and reconstruct the operation. It's like water turning into ice or steam. Cold or hot temperature is the external condition for change, but the real change happens within the water itself. When the temperature reaches freezing or boiling point, the structure of the chemicals of the water reconstructs into a new form. It is a transformation of quantity to quality, which dialectical materialism believes is one of the fundamental laws in the motion of water. It is not simply a sum of elementary processes, as associationistic psychology saw, but qualitatively new in form that appears, and this new form appears in the process of transformation. In this video, we've considered concepts important to Vygotsky's approach to thinking about human development. We've reviewed dialectical materialism, a concept that on the surface may be one that may not as frequently be discussed as his well-known concepts, but it is through understanding this concept of dialectical materialism that we can better understand what differentiated Vygotsky from other theorists, as his focus was on the process of development. He believed that any psychological process, whether the development of thought or voluntary behavior, is a process undergoing changes right before one's eyes. We need to focus not on the product of development, but the process. Again, very much connected to constructivism. We've reviewed key concepts that Vygotsky is known for, like the zone of proximal development, the role of the more knowledgeable other in the learning process, and the relationship between language and thought, and his idea that egocentric speech transitions into inner speech. In other words, that there is a transition taking place instead of, as Piaget suggested, one being replaced by the other. What we see is that Vygotsky truly saw psychology as a tool to telescope changes that other theorists may have missed or at least were not focusing on. We've also looked at Vygotsky's view that language is a psychological tool that connects humans with their external world and helps humans develop from a biological to a conscious level and master their own actions. And that the use of language brings a revolutionary change to human development, as Vygotsky suggested. It is a change with the relationship with others. He saw it as a change in one's relationship to the self and a change in one's way of thinking. We've also considered the important role of culture in affecting human development. Vygotsky believed that it is social interactions that make internal experiences possible. His sociocultural theory views human development as a socially mediated process in which children acquire their cultural values, their beliefs, and problem-solving strategies through collaborative dialogues with more knowledgeable members of society. Vygotsky passed away at the young age of 37 in 1934. After his passing, colleagues continued working on their own research programs, bringing Vygotskyan thinking to wider audiences. Vygotsky's ideas and fundamental beliefs did not truly vanish with the author's death, but continued to develop in later years. The Vygotskyan Circle was instrumental in publishing and promoting Vygotsky's work posthumously. Several of Vygotsky's students published their own works shortly after his death. Although these students published content under their own names, the works were based on close collaboration with Vygotsky or research he conducted himself. Consequently, we can consider some of these publications to be Vygotsky's work to a large extent. By focusing exclusively on works authored by Vygotsky alone, we could be excluding a large amount of research that is de facto an extension of his own original thought.